Good morning and welcome to Bible Truth for Kids. Today our story is called Jesus' Trial Before Pilate. Remember last week Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane and they had brought him to the high priest to stand trial, and they condemned him to death for claiming that he was the Son of God. But they didn't have the authority to put him to death. Only the Romans could do that. And so this morning they are bringing him before Pilate, the Roman governor. Now this little map here will help us understand how things have been happening. Jesus and his disciples came this way up to the Garden of Gethsemane, but the rulers brought him back into the city this way, right to the palace of the high priest. And now they're bringing him over here to where Pilate is. That is where Pilate stays when he's in Jerusalem. You know, he's in Jerusalem because it's Passover and there are thousands and thousands of extra people in the city, and he needs to keep control. He has to make sure there are no riots, things like that. So first thing, those religious leaders are waiting for Pilate, and Pilate came out and said, so this is you're bringing me this man, what are his charges? And they said, well, we wouldn't be bringing him to you unless he was a criminal. Oh, Pilate said, well, judge him by your own laws. You know, Pilate didn't want to get involved. And they said, well, we don't have the authority to put anyone to death. And they said, you know, he claims that he's a king. He says he's king of the Jews. Well, they knew that would interest Pilate, and it did, because a king could be a threat to the Roman government. So he did bring Jesus into his headquarters, and he said, are you a king? And Jesus admitted that he was. But he said, my kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is from above. If my kingdom was of this world, my servants would be fighting. So Pilate said, so you are a king. And Jesus said, for this purpose I was born into the world, to speak the truth of God, so that people who hear will believe the truth. Well, Pilate kept questioning him, but, you know, he couldn't really find that he had done anything wrong. So he went back out and he called the religious leaders to him and he said, look, I don't find anything wrong. I don't find that he's done anything wrong. Well, those leaders, they're upset. And they began to accuse him of all kinds of things. And they said, you know, he's stirring up all the people, even you know, he's teaching, he's getting them all upset, and he's been teaching all this kind of stuff through Judea right on up to Galilee. And so when Pilate heard that, he said, Galilee? Well, I'm not in charge of Galilee. Herod's in charge of that area. And so I thought, I'll send him over to Herod. You know, the Roman government had appointed Herod as a king over certain areas, and Galilee was one of them. Pilate didn't want to deal with this problem. Now let's see if we can find out where Herod is here. So we've got Pilate here. Now Herod is over here. And so they're going to bring Jesus now over to see Herod. And those religious leaders are going to follow. Now when Herod heard that Jesus was coming, you know, the Bible tells us that he was glad because he'd never met Jesus. And he wanted to, because he was hoping that Jesus would perform, you know, a sign, a trick, as Herod thought of it. He'd heard about these things. He was hoping Jesus would do that. Well, now this is Herod's palace. It's quite magnificent. He loved to build things. But you know, nothing of what Herod hoped for happened when Jesus got there. And Herod questioned him extensively. But Jesus didn't make any reply. He didn't answer any of those questions. And you know, chief priests and the rulers, they were right behind, and they were yelling out their own accusations, but Jesus didn't say a word. He didn't say a single thing. He didn't even say, you know, that's not right. Or he didn't say, that's not true. He didn't defend himself at all. And so finally, Herod was fed up with that. Jesus wouldn't say a thing, and he wouldn't do a thing. And so he called his soldiers over and he said, take him away. Do something with him. Well, the soldiers did take him away. And you know, they put on splendid clothing, the Bible tells us, kind of clothing that a king would wear, and they mocked him, and they made fun of him, and they taunted him, and they carried on like that for quite a while until Herod said, "No, that's fine, that's enough. Send him back to Pilate." So now, whoops, I wanted to show you the map. So now Herod is sending Jesus back again to Pilate. That's a lot of zigzagging, isn't it? From the high priest to Pilate to Herod to Pilate. But that's what happened. Now, you know, during Passover, there's crowds and word travels fast. People are talking about everything. And they knew something was going on with Jesus. They knew that he was before Pilate. And so they're wondering, like, what's going on? Is there a trial? And they're really hanging around that whole area that I just showed you. So this time, when Jesus came back to Pilate, he called everybody together. He called the rulers and the chief priests and even the people. And, you know, he gathered them all together and he said, "Look, you have brought me this man, and we have questioned him. I've questioned him, and I can't find anything wrong with him. And even Herod can't, because Herod sent him back to me." Now, you know, during Passover, one of the things that happened every year was that Pilate would release a prisoner to them, anybody that they wanted. You know, it could be somebody who hadn't even finished out their prison term. It didn't matter what they had done. It was like what we would call today a pardon. And Pilate was allowed to release a prisoner every year. And, you know, now the crowd had started asking Pilate to do what he did every year, which was release us a prisoner. And so Pilate said to the crowd, because they'd started gathering around his palace, and you can see the people are out here now. And Pilate thought, well, you know, the people will probably feel sorry for Jesus. I mean, he hasn't done anything wrong. He can't find anything wrong. And so he said, "Shall I release to you Jesus, who's called the Christ?" Oh, they said, "No, we don't want Jesus released. We want Barabbas released." Well, who's Barabbas? You know, Barabbas was a well-known criminal. I mean, the year before, he had been causing riots. He had killed people. He had been in prison. And now they're calling for Barabbas. Well, you know, Pilate was wondering what to do. And just during that time, he got word from his wife. His wife sent him a message. His wife said, "I had a dream last night about Jesus. He's a righteous man. And I've been troubled all day since that dream. Don't have anything to do with him." Well, was that a warning? Well, if it was, Pilate just ignored it. And now he's feeling great pressure. He doesn't know what to do because the crowd is angry. The chief priests, well, they're jealous and they're angry. And he's got to protect Rome. But he also wants to protect himself. I mean, he's got power. He doesn't want to lose that power. So he said to them again, "Shall I release you Jesus?" And they kept saying, "Barabbas, Barabbas." And he said, "Well, then what shall I do with Jesus?" And they said, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said, "Why? What has he done wrong?" But they just said all the louder, "Crucify him, crucify him." So Pilate said, "Well, why don't I just punish him? And then I'll let him go." But the crowd said no. And you know, Pilate wanted people to like him. And he couldn't stand up and do the right thing. And so he just said to his soldiers, "Crucify him." He just turned away from Jesus like that. Now the soldiers then, they took Jesus and they took him outside. They took off his clothes and they put on a purple robe because after all, he said he was a king. And then they made a crown of thorns and put that on his head too, because every king needs a crown. Now in Jerusalem, in Israel, there are trees like this. They're called acacia trees, and you can see they have very long thorns. So this might be what they made the crown of thorns out of, because these branches are actually quite flexible. And they made him a crown like that, stuck it on his head. And then they beat him. They spit on him. They hit him on the head with a rod, and they scourged him. Now, scourging means that they took something that was called a Roman flagrum, and you can see how the tips have little pieces of curved metal. They whipped him with that. That was a lot of suffering. And then when they were done with that, when they were done with him, they stripped off that purple robe and put his own clothes back on, and they led him out to be crucified. You know, Pilate let an innocent man be killed. He had had a chance to listen to the Son of God, but he didn't. Now, there's been a lot of suffering in today's story, you know, and you just wonder, like, did Jesus have to do that? Did he have to suffer that way? Well, Jesus had prayed to the Father himself, and he had said, is there any other way? Is there any other way that sin can be paid for? And the Father said, no, this was the way. So Jesus, because he was willing to do anything the Father wanted, he went through all that suffering and right on out to the cross, like we'll see next week. But Jesus knew that beyond that, when it was over, there would be great joy. And you are part of that joy that he knew would come from all of this. So next week, we'll learn more about that. We'll see you then.